There is a point in every career when the threat is not a rival in your industry, but the people across your family table who believe tearing you down is a reasonable request. My name is Roxanne, and I was told that mentioning my professional achievements was inconsiderate because it might make my older sister feel inferior. My dad said it casually right after I shared a major milestone at work. He looked me straight in the face and said, "Do not talk about your success. You make her feel bad." It was not guidance. It was an order. That conversation did not happen in childhood or during teenage insecurities. It happened while I was working full-time in pharmaceutical research in Orlando, handling clinical data that determined whether a drug deserved approval. I was pushing for measurable progress, but my family treated it like background noise. In their version of the world, my role meant nothing because the only person allowed to shine was my sister. When a family designates one person as the standard, everyone else is expected to shrink until their voice disappears. That was the expectation placed on me, wrapped in buzzwords about emotional maturity. Mom called it keeping the peace. Dad called it empathy. In reality, it was instruction to erase myself so someone else could feel comfortable. They assumed I would tolerate it. They assumed a private reprimand could slow me down. Later, someone in that house escalated way beyond a conversation and believed I would not have the ability to respond. If you want to hear how a harmless request turned into sabotage and how I handled it, stay here, tap follow, and tell me whether you would have stayed quiet. When I completed my academic training, I did not have a trust fund or a private allowance cushioning the cost of tuition certification exams or relocation, so I worked through school-secured entry-level research shifts and paid for the same credentials that shaped the clinical analysts Orlando depends on. I covered my own insurance, filed my taxes every year, and negotiated rental agreements without having anyone loop a family friend into the conversation. I needed performance to speak for me, so I collected documented results, quarterly evaluations, and measurable outcomes that showed I could deliver value inside a controlled system. I made enough mistakes to understand that progress depends on staying present when pressure becomes uncomfortable. Later, my sister Valerie arrived inside the same industry with none of the preparation I had endured. She secured her position after my parents sent emails to acquaintances who sat on advisory panels, and she entered at a level that usually requires evidence of productivity. I watched the situation unfold without raising my voice, because pointing out the contrast would have turned into a lecture about family loyalty. They told colleagues that Valerie possessed a natural instinct for leadership, while I had tangible work logs showing what I completed under supervision. I learned something from that dynamic. Privilege rarely acknowledges itself. I was in my late 20s when I stopped waiting for their approval. Valerie was slightly older, yet she treated regulations like suggestions. She preferred shortcuts that avoided scrutiny. I did not relate to her approach because clinical data requires proof rather than charisma. I was busy forming a portfolio that could survive an internal audit. That meant maintaining consistent numbers, recording verified data, and presenting summaries that established whether a compound merited continued study. My manager noticed the consistency, which was the only validation I needed. Outside work, I handled the realities of American adulthood. I paid rent on time, I shouldered premiums for health coverage, and I paid income tax without complaining that fairness required someone else to manage my obligations. I bought groceries that matched the week's budget and declined outings if the expense could jeopardize savings. I did not rely on anyone to guarantee my comfort. I understood that survival meant taking responsibility rather than assuming that unconditional rescue was waiting. That difference created tension inside my parents' house because mentioning responsibility sounded accusatory to people who did not choose it. As my results accumulated, internal feedback shifted. A supervisor asked whether I would consider being evaluated for a specialized analyst track. I did not make dramatic announcements about it. I reviewed the criteria, accepted additional files, and advanced deadlines without discussing the process at home. Eventually, my manager said, Your consistency is difficult to ignore. Hearing that affirmed every hour I spent building documentation instead of chasing acceptance from people who never acknowledged output. Meanwhile, Valerie reacted to my progress in unpredictable ways. If someone at work praised my ability to complete a complex summary, she interrupted to mention that her workload involved tasks demanding emotional intelligence. When someone acknowledged my turnaround time, she claimed that excessive efficiency could threaten workplace culture. The contrast between performance and interpretation became clearer each month, and I realized she did not want equal opportunity. She wanted uncontested space. One afternoon, she asked me, "Do you ever think about how your metrics make everyone else look inadequate?" I replied carefully because I understood the trap behind that framing. I said, "Numbers are not personal. They show whether a process works." Valerie rolled her eyes and said, "Everything is personal if someone feels overshadowed." That sentence explained every warning my parents ever delivered. Pressure increased after the company circulated a memo about projected restructuring. It stated that specialized output could determine placement during future evaluations. I focused on doing the work correctly, without interpreting it as an invitation to compete with anyone. Valerie acted like the notice was a personal threat. She whispered to coworkers that the scoring system benefited people with my personality. I ignored the noise and concentrated on accuracy, because strategic panic never produces evidence. The last signal arrived when another supervisor identified my analysis as a model for training sessions. I did not brag. I continued completing assignments. Valerie's expression hardened each time my name appeared in internal communication. She stopped making small talk and she scrutinized every action I took. I started noticing how resentment can masquerade as discomfort. I did not view myself as superior. I saw myself as responsible. Yet responsibility unsettled a structure that depended on unequal expectations. Valerie wanted favorable treatment without measurable proof. I wanted the documentation that allowed career movement. That difference mattered because entitlement reacts violently when reality interrupts. 1 year later, the landscape inside my department shifted toward measurable outcomes that prioritized whoever carried verified data across each quarterly checkpoint. I had built a consistent record that translated into a higher annual adjustment and a new set of tasks involving compound validation. I did not negotiate through favors or informal leverage because my credibility hinged on reproducible results rather than personality. The internal trackers began placing my name near the top due to the reliability of batches that moved through my desk without corrective rewrites. I handled each assignment with the awareness that every number might survive an audit, so accuracy mattered more than excitement. The increase in income followed the structure posted for all employees since no one could distort a rubric anchored in recorded performance. Valerie reacted to these signals in a controlled yet unmistakable manner. She developed a habit of visiting our supervisor right after submissions, attempting to reduce the weight of what I had delivered. She whispered that my supporting documents were derivative, or that the efficiency metrics did not reflect high-level judgment. She implied that my contribution should remain invisible, because if anyone credited my work, it would misrepresent hierarchy. The tone did not sound like feedback about workflow. It carried the premise that acknowledgement created damage. At first, I observed without speaking because naming sabotage before it matures often backfires. Valerie measured every interaction according to whether the spotlight tilted toward her. If a proposal succeeded, she questioned whether I deserved inclusion. If a project stalled, she hinted that my influence distorted it. Those patterns exposed motive, not analysis. One evening, Dad called before I could shut down my laptop, and his voice skipped any kind of concern. He cleared his throat and said, "Do not create a situation where your sister looks lesser than you. She needs space to feel accomplished." He spoke as if success had a moral ceiling. He framed restraint as virtue. I recognized the familiar pressure that pretends to prevent conflict while demanding that one side erase effort. He did not ask about the criteria used to evaluate staff. He focused on the optics of proximity. That conversation carried an assumption that Valerie's comfort determined the permissible volume of my progress. I acknowledged his words without providing fuel, because engaging emotional logic never converts it into reason. Shortly after that exchange, a representative from HR reached out to request supporting files for a recent authorization. The tone remained professional rather than disciplinary, signaling an internal review of workflow distribution. They asked for timelines, revision logs, author names associated with each approval, and a chart explaining how the margin of error had stabilized. I provided everything because documentation had been my shield from the beginning. When HR saw the clarity of the archive, they scheduled a follow-up to examine how those processes became standard practice. No one referenced Valerie. They evaluated data rather than reputation. That distinction held value within a corporation expected to justify payroll. The reaction inside my family home diverged from HR's neutrality. My mother argued that public praise could collapse Valerie's momentum. She encouraged silence because her career takes priority. When I asked how recognition equaled sabotage, she responded that internal sentiment always outweighs charts. My father repeated the earlier position that a household should not contain competition. They did not acknowledge that suppressing one daughter to inflate another creates inequity. They spoke as if hierarchy constituted love. I chose not to debate that logic. Instead, I archived every internal message connected to project approvals. I saved timestamps involving Valerie's attempts to minimize deliverables. I stored direct quotes without assigning emotional labels. Evidence never requires volume. It requires precision. I understood that corporations protect themselves by punishing misrepresentation, not rivalry. If anyone attempted to distort findings, I wanted an unbroken chain of documentation that could withstand review. The process was not revenge. It was preparation for accountability, because outcomes built from data do not collapse when confronted. 6 months later, the temperature inside our project meetings felt different. Valerie walked into every conference room with a confidence that did not come from any dataset or validation report. It came from the belief that no one would challenge her when she redirected credit toward herself. We were developing a new research line that required stability calculations, replication cycles, and documented assay results. I had stayed late for weeks to refine the error tolerance model. When Holden, my direct manager, asked for clarification in a meeting, I noticed how quickly Valerie interrupted. She lifted her chin and said, "That is my section." I already briefed her on how to phrase the summary. Holden's eyebrow twitched and he shifted his attention toward her. I did not correct her. I knew silence could become a record. Her behavior escalated. Whenever Holden pointed toward any measurable progress, Valerie positioned herself to imply authority. If my slide deck demonstrated improvements in molecular binding consistency, she leaned forward and announced that she had started the initial direction. When someone praised the clarity of the statistical dashboard, she smiled and said that she had suggested the layout. She learned to speak first because the first claim to ownership plants an impression. I responded by recording everything. Outside those meetings, I built a quiet archive. I saved final files. I logged timestamps. I used the compliance system that protects intellectual labor inside most American corporate structures. I did not narrate my intentions. I collected proof. I wanted a history that no one could challenge. If someone reviewed us, they would find documented evidence of each contribution. Valerie assumed impressions were stronger than data. I understood that data outlasts charm. Holden began calibrating our evaluations through molecular outcomes. He reviewed viability percentages, cycling loss, and assay variance. I passed every review with supporting documentation. Valerie talked in circles and presented no formal proof. She claimed involvement without describing the methodology. Holden did not reprimand anyone. He logged his observations and waited for quarterly confirmation. The company valued compliance. Performance without evidence turns into speculation. I stayed patient. Validation requires distance. At home, emotional pressure continued. I visited our parents one weekend, and Mom smirked when she heard about the research metrics. She said that I should stop showing off numbers like a child desperate for approval. Dad told me, do not make Valerie feel inferior. Their tone was not guidance. It was an attempt to manage outcomes. Valerie sat nearby with an expression of earned entitlement. The contrast was predictable. They celebrated her assumptions and minimized my reports. I did not react. The living room was not an audit room. Nothing spoken there could override corporate procedure. When the company announced an internal recognition event, Valerie reacted as if someone had handed her a coronation script. She used the next team call to mention how tirelessly she had guided the research model. She acted as if the award already belonged to her. She leaned close to the camera and told me, "Maybe try not to look so eager. It is embarrassing." Holden kept a neutral expression. He said nothing to confirm or deny her fantasy. I prepared without disclosure. I updated files that proved origin. I gathered every iteration. I checked each compliance tag. I did not argue through conversation. Corporate policy rewards documentation more than performance theater. Valerie knew how to speak. I knew how to prove. Her confidence increased during the week before the ceremony. She told a senior colleague that she intended to use the stage to thank Holden for recognizing her leadership. She then said in a louder voice, "Some people cannot handle watching others shine." She wanted me to flinch. I looked back at my screen and finalized the last authentication report. I shaped a strategy that did not violate procedure. I would present when asked. I would answer questions directly. If Holden or HR required clarification about project ownership, I would supply the records. I did not need applause. I needed accuracy. The system protects accuracy when proof is undeniable. I waited. The right moment would arrive through policy rather than emotion. Documentation never rushes. It sits until someone opens it. Then it speaks. The evening before the company's internal recognition event, a restless tension grew around the building because everyone understood that public recognition could shift an internal hierarchy in ways that private reviews never could. Valerie behaved as if the outcome had already been signed, and she drafted a deck that assigned major deliverables to her personal initiative. She never asked for confirmation yet. She treated her opinion like verified fact, and she intended to present that fantasy in a crowded room. I gave her space because a false story rarely survives first contact with a decision-maker who understands numbers. She paced around our shared kitchen while adjusting her slides, and she tried to bait me with a line that she believed would land. Valerie said, "You should sit in the back row tonight. It might spare you embarrassment once Holden understands who carried this weight." Her voice carried more delight than menace. She expected a reaction that showed fear, but I refused to validate the performance. I simply said, "You have rehearsed a conclusion that is easier than proving one." Then I returned to my laptop. On another call, Mom asked Valerie whether she had prepared enough visual impact to make an impression, and Valerie responded, "Holden loves clarity. I will give him clarity about who did the actual work." The sentence was designed to plant humiliation. Dad added a line that sounded like cheap encouragement. Dad said Roxanne needs a lesson in humility. Someone should remind her that a paycheck means nothing without respect. I stayed silent because every provocation confirmed a belief system rather than evidence. I no longer looked for validation from voices that never wanted to evaluate data. I focused on compliance. I finalized a portfolio that contained logs, peer reviews, assay results timelines, and electronic signatures. It remained clinical and exact. There were no emotional explanations. There were no subjective interpretations. It remained a record that could survive any audit threshold. I sent the file to Holden through the proper channel because a manager deserves time to review information without theatrical pressure. Within 10 minutes, my phone buzzed. Holden said, "Let us schedule a separate discussion after the ceremony. I want to walk through your portfolio." The tone carried interest rather than doubt, and I recognized a shift. Holden wanted clarity from me first, which meant Valerie would not control the framing. I replied, "I am available whenever the review is useful," then closed the message. Valerie kept rehearsing a narrative that depended on exaggeration. She told one teammate during a hallway exchange, "I am lifting research velocity," while Roxanne hides behind numbers. She mimics competence without original thinking. She wanted people to anticipate a takedown. She never imagined that performance reviews operate on documentation rather than rumor. I watched her strategy develop and allowed gravity to do its work. The internal announcement described a short ceremony, with a small stage, a microphone, and a sequence of presentations that showcased contributions from multiple teams. Valerie described it as her night. She said, "I am giving Holden a map," and she meant it as a threat. For her humiliation felt like a legitimate management tool. I knew better than to stop her. A manager does not need rescue from misinformation. Mom asked whether I felt nervous about attending an event where a sibling intended to broadcast dominance. Mom said, "You can still withdraw. Valerie deserves the moment without interference." I answered, "A moment is not the same as accuracy." The silence on the line suggested they wanted submission, not dialogue. I no longer needed to warn anyone. I preferred the integrity of real-time exposure. Numbers travel further when spoken aloud in a public room. If Valerie attempted to polish fiction into a visible achievement, the discrepancy would reveal itself the moment Holden asked a single technical question. When I left the apartment, Valerie smiled at her reflection while practicing a final line. She whispered, "Tonight will be decisive." I agreed in my mind, although for a different reason. The stage could not protect a story that failed to meet procedural standards. I welcomed the opportunity to let evidence breathe. That night, the awards ceremony began inside a mid-sized ballroom arranged by HR to spotlight internal performance. I sat in the second row, directly across from the podium, because Holden wanted the entire research group to be visible to the front office. Valerie stood near the stage in a fitted navy dress, holding a printed deck that she had revised without permission. I sensed her anticipation, and I recognized the subtle tension around her mouth that always surfaced whenever she thought she had secured superiority without proof. The program director opened the evening with a short welcome and introduced Holden as the lead sponsor. After a brief acknowledgement of milestones, he announced that Valerie would speak first regarding our oncology pipeline project. Mom and Dad applauded before anyone else reacted. They sat close to the aisle, eager to witness a theatrical humiliation they believed I deserved, because Valerie had conditioned them to interpret every challenge to her assertions as disloyalty. Valerie walked up to the microphone and arranged her slides. Her voice carried an artificial confidence that relied on exaggeration instead of documented metrics. She said, "This entire stage gate rested on my quantitative analysis, and I pushed the modeling forward when no one else had enough stability." She paused to let the implication settle. Then she offered a sharpened line meant to wound me publicly. "Some people contribute busy work and call it science, but leadership knows who actually delivers." I heard Mom whisper something triumphant to Dad, and I watched his expression tighten with vindication. Valerie advanced her slides, skipping tables that required citations and emphasizing color blocks that falsely portrayed ownership. I stayed silent because I had verified every version and archived every timestamp, and I understood that interrupting her would collapse the procedural discipline that mattered most now. Holden stood at the edge of the stage, observing Valerie's performance, with an expression I could not decode entirely. He waited until she finished a segment about predictive durability that lacked replicates. When a director from analytics raised a question about sample count, Valerie offered circular phrasing that never addressed methodology. The room shifted subtly. Several attendees glanced at one another, searching for clarity. I recognized uncertainty forming. Instead of intervening, I breathed carefully and kept my hands still. I wanted Holden to control the cadence. He had told me previously that accuracy wins without theatrics, and I took that guidance seriously. Valerie returned to her aggressive tone. I was carrying operational risk while someone else needed hand-holding to understand the math, she declared. A quiet impulse moved through the chairs. Doubt gained momentum. Holden finally lifted his hand to stop her. He thanked her politely and said, "We will invite Roxanne to share her perspective once Valerie concludes. We want to make sure the data trail is explicit." Valerie hesitated because she recognized that phrasing as a strategic pivot. She tried to stall with closing remarks that reframed unsupported claims, but Holden redirected the spotlight. Valerie cleared her throat and made one more attempt at dominance. I protected this program from instability, and if there was confusion, it never came from my side. She ended with a self-satisfied nod and stepped away from the podium. Mom clapped before anyone else reacted. Dad followed. The applause was small and uneven, and several people avoided committing to enthusiasm. Holden looked toward me. I remained seated, waiting for an explicit invitation, because I wanted him to own the procedural authority. I saw a regulatory specialist reviewing a printed packet, and her brow furrowed when she noticed missing raw figures. The room knew something was incomplete. Holden spoke without decorative language. "Roxanne, please walk us through your documentation and address the sampling questions that were raised." Holden shifted the microphone toward me once he confirmed the room had settled. I opened the folder I had prepared, which contained the sampling audit, the time-stamped email thread, and the assay chain of custody. I did not apologize. I did not mention emotion. I began with the only language that mattered inside a research institution: data with origin, signature, and trace. I explained the timeline in complete order, beginning with the raw sample submission, dated February 12th, registered under my user ID, authenticated by the validation portal, and linked to the digital lab notebook that carried my initials. I saw a director lean forward because he recognized the submission number. I continued with the extraction log that identified who performed each action. I pointed to the slide where the repository displayed Valerie's absence during the primary analysis. The room absorbed the visual contradiction between her performance minutes earlier and the actual recorded sequence. I did not annotate my tone. I allowed the material to speak. When I moved to the email thread, Valerie snapped. She spoke loudly from her chair without waiting for permission. "You are cherry-picking whatever flatters you. Anyone can paste emails to look important." There was agitation in her breath. She wanted to provoke an argument because that had always been her method with my father and mother watching. I ignored the interruption and read the line where the project manager assigned me the modeling deliverable with an explicit note stating that Valerie was responsible only for formatting tables. Valerie rose from her seat. "This is pathetic. You are embarrassing yourself. Nobody needs a procedural recital." Holden raised a hand toward her and said with neutral firmness, "Remain seated. You will not interrupt compliance review." Father exchanged a confused glance with Mother because neither of them understood the authority in that tone. They had expected my voice to shake. It did not. I turned to the section regarding assay reproducibility. I presented the triplicate results that establish stability requirements. Every value traced back to my bench notes, documented with reagent lot and calibrated equipment. The head of quality assurance asked Valerie directly, "Do you have replicates that contradict this?" Valerie answered without hesitation, "I do not have to prove anything to someone who manipulates documentation." Holden cut across the air before that sentence traveled further. "Accusations without evidence will stop." He invited Meredith, the HR lead in charge of performance oversight, to approach the front. Meredith carried a compliance tablet. She reviewed the attribution string on the internal database, then looked up at the room. "There are discrepancies in credit assignment. We need a temporary freeze until proper evaluation is completed." Valerie panicked. "Freeze what I earned credit. She is weaponizing paperwork because she has nothing else." Holden replied, "You are being placed on administrative suspension until we verify ownership. This is not negotiable." That was the first time the room exhaled collectively. Mother made a small noise, something between disbelief and insult. Father whispered her name, searching for the narrative that allowed them to keep Valerie invincible. Valerie shook her head, almost trembling. Suspend me for understanding the bigger picture. This is ridiculous. Meredith tapped the tablet and said, Valerie, you are relieved of project duties, effective immediately. No one clapped. The silence worked like a verdict. I remained still because the goal had never been spectacle. The goal was documentation that no one could rewrite. A regulatory specialist approached Holden and said she would oversee chain of custody reconciliation. 2 associates from analytics asked for access to the log I had maintained. I agreed. I did not smile. Valerie tried again. You think this means people respect you? They feel sorry for you. She wanted an emotional exchange. I gave her nothing. I stood beside Holden while Meredith organized the preliminary inquiry. A senior director nodded at me slowly, acknowledging the restraint that mattered to corporate memory. Mother stared as if betrayal were personal. Father avoided my eyes. I had no interest in their reconciliation. The room's validation held more weight than a family that expected silence in exchange for survival. Holden dismissed the group for a short recess to allow documentation transfer. I closed my folder and walked away from the podium without looking behind me. 1 week after the ceremony, I received an internal announcement that confirmed what the room had already predicted. HR had completed its attribution review, and Valerie was formally terminated for credit falsification, documentation, manipulation, and obstruction during a compliance assessment. Meredith attached a note indicating that her personnel file would reference ethical misconduct, which meant future credentialing panels could request supplemental review. I read the notice once, closed the email, and returned to my schedule. Later that afternoon, Holden told me that Valerie had requested a professional reference to support an external application. He explained that regulatory positions required verifiable ownership trails, which meant he could not certify performance statements that contradicted data. He spoke without hostility. He simply honored institutional policy. I felt no thrill. I understood that Valerie was discovering a world where sentiment could not erase records. Holden mentioned another detail. Valerie had contacted 2 scientific managers at competing firms, and both of them requested chain of custody from the project that triggered her suspension. She could not provide an alternative log. The absence itself functioned as a verdict. Her attempts to minimize documentation standards failed because the field depended on authenticity, not narrative. When the conversation ended, Holden asked me to step into a planning meeting for a new analytical initiative. The director of research development stated that a principal analyst position required someone who demonstrated procedural integrity under pressure. He said the evaluation panel had reviewed the ceremony and noted my restraint. I accepted the role not because it signaled triumph, but because it aligned with the work I cared about. The promotion included responsibility for resource management and mentoring junior associates. I scheduled orientation sessions, established communication protocols, and assigned preliminary modeling tasks. None of it required emotional justification. It was a maintenance of standards which steadied the department during transition. 2 days later, I received a call from my father. He did not ask whether I was busy. He began by stating that Valerie was devastated, that an employer had declined to proceed without a reference, and that family should protect family. He implied that I had weaponized humiliation. I let him finish. I told him that compliance departments did not reward image laundering. His voice hardened as he warned that resentment would isolate me. I ended the call. There was nothing to negotiate. That evening, my mother left a message on my phone, explaining that I could repair the situation by offering reassurance to Valerie. She suggested that women in family systems must absorb injury to preserve closeness. I deleted the message and did not reply. The binary was clear. Either I submitted to distortion, or I preserved stability. I chose stability. I blocked both of their numbers the next morning because repetition would not produce transformation. Silence protected my capacity for work. I returned to the office, finished a training module for 2 new researchers, and submitted a resource tracking plan before the deadline. There was no image of reconciliation. I did not send an olive branch. Valerie attempted to contact colleagues for sympathy, but HR provided neutral statements that confirmed her separation. No one asked me to comfort her, and no one positioned family unity as a corporate objective. Professional environments did not subsidize personal mythologies. A week carried its own clarity. I maintained distance from every voice that demanded containment. I accepted the promotion without ceremony. I slept without tension. If Valerie pursued another field, she would meet another compliance system. If she attempted to blame injustice, she would confront another record trail. My parents would search for validation inside their own disappointment. None of it required my presence. I understood that boundaries were not weapons. They were architecture. Integrity does not perform for applause. It preserves functionality when sentiment interferes with accountability. I learned that documentation protects work from revisionist interpretation, especially when a family system normalizes distortion. Silence is not passivity. It is a resource that prevents emotional extortion. When evidence becomes the only language, entitlement collapses. There is no virtue in shrinking to soothe another person's fragility. Survival is not compliance. Stability requires distance. Thank you for listening without demanding a softer ending. Some situations do not heal because healing is not owed. If you recognize systems where achievement must be hidden to protect someone else's comfort, describe your experience in the comments. Share what boundaries cost you and whether distance brought clarity. Follow for more stories about documentation consequence and the strength to disengage from inherited expectations.